Hello everyone, my name is Stefan. I am a volunteer here at the New Jersey National Guard and Militia Museum, and today I will be giving a presentation on the history of the Kalashnikov assault rifle. Everything from its origins, its use during the Cold War, and its influence and persistence to the modern day. Now, first, a little bit about myself. As I mentioned, my name is Stefan. I recently graduated from American University with an undergraduate degree in political science and a concentration in comparative politics. I'm really big into anything related to the geopolitics or military studies of everything from Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union. Here at the museum, I did video production on a variety of the Eastern European firearms that we have in our inventory, both on display and in our archive. Recently, I've also covered Eastern European and especially Serbian geopolitics for a magazine, the New Eastern Europe. And I can speak very good Serbian, a good chunk of Russian, and a little bit of Ukrainian. And now, with about me and personal details out of the way, we can move on to the origins, the nitty-gritty of the history. Now, before Kalashnikov, before the AK, before any of that, we have to go to the Second World War. Now, like the First World War that came before, the Second World War was a major moment of innovation for militaries across the world. Before the war, you had a lot of the established doctrines and technology still carrying over from the First World War. However, the rapid changes during the Second World War introduced and pioneered a lot of new revolutionary technologies. There was the advancement in tanks, aviation, rocketry, and even the most devastating thing ever produced by mankind, the nuclear weapon. Small arms was no exception. The necessities of conflict and the other stringent requirements of battle prompted a lot of innovation in small arms in almost every single country, including things like self-loading rifles and submachine guns. However, the Germans were quite insistent on, especially in the last couple of years of the war, creating new, radical, so believed war-winning technologies that they put faith in that they could radically change the course of the conflict, the so-called Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons, and which gave us things like the V-2 rocket, the Me-262 fighter jet. And one of the weapons that were expected to make a rapid turnaround for the German infantrymen was the German Sturmgewehr, the STG-44. Now, its history goes back to the final year or so of Germany's participation of the war, all the way back to 1942, where German engineers were attempting to manufacture a self-loading select-fire rifle in an intermediate cartridge. It did not pick up significance early on. However, in late 1942, it was accepted into service in small experimental batches. However, in 1943 is when it became properly introduced into the army, the so-called MP-43. Now, the notion of the assault rifle, that being a rifle caliber, rifle barrel length weapon that feeds from a magazine, select fire, an intermediate cartridge, was a extremely novel concept at the time. Nothing really like that existed at all. Some people, now this is a historical debate, whether the German Sturmgewehr was the first assault rifle or the World War I era Fyodorov Automat from the Russian Empire. It's a very contentious debate. Some people say it's the Sturmgewehr, some people say it's the Fyodorov. Now, bias warning, I more subscribe to the Sturmgewehr being the first true assault rifle because it fires from a proper intermediate cartridge, unlike the Fyodorov, which fires from a full-sized Arisaka rifle cartridge. But other than that, the Sturmgewehr, well, in 1942, it would be renamed as the Sturmgewehr, as the German High Command and Hitler himself were counting on radical new innovative weapons to win Germany the war. The Sturmgewehr entered service, and even though only around 500,000 were manufactured, did leave an impression for regular members of the army and the Waffen-SS. However, Germany was not the only one to be experimenting with new weapons for their infantry. The Soviets were also taking note about what was happening on the battlefield. And as they marched through Eastern Europe to the gates of Berlin, they took note about a lot of these new small arms and the rapidly changing aspects of modern warfare, and began working on new weapon systems to replace their already existing older stock of firearms. Now, enter Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov. He was from a poor peasant family in Siberia. He was born in the small Siberian village of Kuria in the Altai region of Siberia, November 10th, 1919. His parents were quite impoverished workers, nothing really of high special note. However, into his young adulthood, he would be enlisted in the Red Army in 1938, and his, at the time, growing affinity for mechanical engineering was put to use in his service in the Red Army. However, things changed for him rapidly in 1941 when the Germans invaded the country and he was conscripted as a tank crewman. In 1942, he would be injured while fighting the Germans during the Battle of Bryansk, and fortunately for him, he did not die, but he was wounded and sent home to recover in a hospital. His recovery time in the hospital was quite important to him, as he learned about a lot of the woes and issues that the average Russian infantryman were encountering on the battlefield. If there's anything anybody should know about Soviet small arms or just military equipment during the time, they needed to produce a lot of equipment very quickly. Hence, they cut a lot of corners, which resulted in issues with things like product quality and reliability. He was hearing from his fellow comrades in the Red Army about their complaints and issues with the reliability of their weapons, and a lot of his comrades came to him and explained to them their frustrations and sense of inferiority compared to German firearms, which they claimed were manufactured to a much better extent. Another issue that more, rather than just the quality of the arms, was the reliability of the regular Soviet infantrymen's weapons and equipment. And he, still having a good affinity for mechanical engineering, asked himself the question, why is it that the Germans have quality arms while the average Soviet infantryman has to struggle with a lot of issues with the quality of their own weapons? And he thought that a good infantryman's rifle should not only be effective during battle, but reliable, where it doesn't jam or cause any other issues. And this personal mantra is that a rifle should be very well suited to the average conscript soldier was something he would eventually carry into his career when designing firearms. Now, it's important to note that during the war, he was quite a small fish, if I can say that phrase, in the Soviet bureaucracy. As a low-level mechanical engineer, nobody really paid that much attention to him. He struggled. There was practically no thought that he could, at the moment in 43 or 44, compete with big names in the Soviet firearms manufacturing industry like Tokarev, Sudayev, Degtyaryov, and other very popular personas and design bureaus within the Soviet military-industrial complex. And during his time of recovery, he started mentally, in his mind, putting into work a successor design to a lot of these Soviet infantry rifles, like the Mosin Nagant or the SVT-40 serviced at the time. However, Kalashnikov was not the only one to be thinking about what should come next, as by the very late stages of the war, the Soviet military-industrial complex was already introducing and experimenting with new weapons. For a majority of the war, your average Russian infantryman was carrying the 5-round bolt-action Mosin-Nagant rifle, a weapon design that dates back to the Russian Empire in 1891, an old rifle at the time. And like many other countries during the war, they realized the utility of having a self-loading magazine-fed weapon that did not have just 5 rounds in its magazine. And the Soviet Union, by 44-45, was already experimenting and introducing replacements for these old, either Russian Imperial or interwar era weapons like the Mosin-Nagant, the DP-27, the DSHK, and other arms, and also including at the time thought modern small arms like the SVT-40. Experiments with the assault rifle already commenced in 1944 with the creation of the AS-44 by Subdayev, which is in the middle right here. Now, you may be thinking, well, the Soviet Union has their assault rifle, congratulations. Well, the problem is the Soviet military-industrial complex and high command was not really satisfied with the AS-44 whatsoever, as it had very poor reliability, and the project was quickly shelved. A few examples exist, but they were not satisfied with it. However, in 1944-45, replacements for infantry weapons like the Mosin-Nagant and DP-27 were already introduced. Degtyaryov introduced the very famous RPD in late 1944. However, it did not see any service in the war and entered service after the end of the conflict. In 1945, Simonov introduced the SKS, a self-loading semi-automatic carbine from a 10-round internal magazine, which was accepted for a short time between 1945 and 1947 as technically the standard issue service rifle of the Red Army. However, Kalashnikov was not deterred. Even though the Soviet Union was already experimenting and introducing new weapon systems, he pushed on. And from his time in the hospital in 1942 to 1946, he was working on a variety of different experimental weapons prototypes over at the Ishevsk factory. And some of them, fortunately, are preserved today, like his prototype submachine gun, the PPK-42. And some don't even have any names. In around 43, 44, 45, he designed a prototype light machine gun that didn't really get anywhere. However, he was convinced, even though that his designs were viewed with a little interest by his higher-ups, he still thought that he had the next big thing. And in 1946, we would finally get to the point where the Soviet military-industrial complex asked for a brand new infantry rifle. And Kalashnikov, finalizing his design for what eventually would become the AK, entered into competition in late 1945-46 for new trials for the next Soviet infantry weapon. Now, within the Soviet army, this was a very big name event. A lot of the major firms and established names within the Soviet military industrial complex were vying for the next position as the next manufacturer for the Soviet Union's modern standard issue service rifle. And a lot of these engineers and designers that were working on these weapons took note of a lot of new concepts and weapons seen during the Second World War, especially combination of weapons received by the Allies, captured weapons from the Germans like the Sturmgewehr, and innovations and experiments already conducted within the Soviet military, and especially calling upon already complete and introduced weapons like the SVT-40, the AVT-40, the AVS-36, and other previous self-loading designs. And all of this crystallized in 1946 to 1947 when the Soviets and a lot of their respective designers came together to push for a new assault rifle. Now, I must clarify that within the Soviet Union, they did not use the term assault rifle. The Germans, well, to be more specific, in American English, we get the term assault rifle from the German term Sturmgewehr, or if I was to directly translate it into English, storm rifle, which then turned into English as assault rifle. In Russia, they don't really have an exact term for that. If they want to refer to an automatic firearm, they just say автомат. However, in 1947, in the late 40s, 50s in general, the term linguistically shifted over to refer to assault rifle, especially to Kalashnikov's design. And in 46 to 47, as the trials were going on, you had a variety of big names like Bulkin and Dementiev, all the way to Tokarev, competing for this spot. Kalashnikov was still almost a no-name within the Soviet military-industrial complex, but he was still viewed as a very talented individual, and his prototype assault rifle was viewed with much promise, and it entered into the competition in late 1946 to 47, and it won handily. A lot of the other weapons that were issued for testing, they struggled especially with reliability. And when Kalashnikov designed his assault rifle, he was very specific that it should be a weapon for the infantryman, that it should be reliable, should be easy to maintain, it should not be some kind of complex, absolutely incomprehensible piece of machinery that requires a lot of very small, intricate moving parts that could cause issues. Reliability was a cornerstone of his design philosophy for his rifle. And finally, in 1947, the Soviet Army accepted his design and it entered service. Now, it is important to note that at this point, Kalashnikov had basically come from out of nowhere and became the next big name within the Soviet military-industrial complex. And especially his AK-47 rifle led him to his fantastic instantaneous success. However, it's also important to note that the AK, even in its early years, changed quite rapidly. To display right here, the original 1947 production AK-47 is actually quite a rarity. If you were to try to find any kind of original 1947 production AK-47s, you would either have to be scouring museums in Russia or some far-flung corners of the earth with strange conflicts you've never heard before, maybe at the bottom of a barrel. Other than that, it is quite rare. Some important things to note with his initial design was that it used a stamped sheet metal receiver, but a major problem was that it was a success for Kalashnikov that finally his design was accepted by the army. But the Soviet army, being a massive multi-million man institution, they needed a lot of these weapons very, very quickly and produced in large numbers. And the original 1947 production AK-47, especially its stamped sheet metal receiver, at the time caused some production problems for the factories producing it, primarily the Izhevsk plant. And so, over time, through the 40s and 50s, there were a variety of changes made to the design, because Kalashnikov and the army was not satisfied. Well, to clarify, they were satisfied, very satisfied with the rifle. However, they still wanted a lot of issues and gripes fixed over time, especially issues over its ease of manufacturing, especially as they deemed the original rifle, the 1947 production, just a little bit too costly. So Kalashnikov got to work on smoothing out a variety of the issues for manufacturing. One of the major changes, now if you notice, the three main iterations, often it is primarily broken down between the Type 1 receiver AK-47 that was produced between 1947 and 1951, the Type 2 receiver AK-47, which was produced between 1951 and 1957, and the Type 3 receiver AK-47 produced between 1955 and 1959. A major change was the switch from a stamped receiver to a milled receiver, where the original AK was stamped sheet metal held with rivets. They changed it where it's a solid block of steel milled to fit in all of the internal components and other things. And a good way to tell the difference between the early iterations and changes of the AK-47 are to look for the changes in the stamped versus milled receiver and other changes with the stock and the grip. For example, the original 1947 production run has the stippled triangular textured grip, the stamped receiver. They changed this in the Type 2 receiver, where the grip has a metal bracket holding it in place and drops the diamond shape, and also a metal bracket holding in the stock. And the Type 3 receiver does a similar thing with changes to the stock and grip, where they removed the large metal bracket from the stock and the grip. As time went on, a lot of the issues with manufacturing cleared up, and by the late 1950s, the AK-47 started becoming a much larger presence as an infantryman's rifle within the Army as they started ramping up production of the rifle. And by the late 1950s, that's when we start seeing the Kalashnikov show up with prominence in the Soviet Army and just the armed forces in general, and outside the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc. Now, it's important to know, by the 1950s, the Soviets still kept the Kalashnikov rifle as a close-guarded secret. They did not want their enemies to know about their new infantry weapon design, especially NATO and the United States. However, they were still, as mentioned before, quite enthusiastic to give their design to Allied countries. In the late 1950s, Poland was granted production access and the design to the Kalashnikov and started making their own. North Korea in 1958 received the design for the AK and started producing their own. China in 1956. Romania in 1963. Hungary in the mid-60s. Bulgaria, similar time. East Germany, also in the late 1950s, started producing their Kalashnikov. The AK was now proliferating within the communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. However, the Americans at this time were pretty much in the dark regarding what this new weapon was. There were only very bits and pieces. There was not much. US intelligence had some idea that the Soviets were introducing a new infantryman's weapon, but they didn't really have any details. The Soviets kept a tight lid on everything. There is even, in the late 1950s, you can find documents and sketches, including this one, of CIA agents trying to piece together that there's this new Soviet assault rifle being proliferated, entering service within the Soviet armed forces. And this in particular is a late 1950s sketch by a CIA agent from memory of this new intermediate caliber rifle submachine gun weapon system that the Soviets are introducing. And overall, other than reports here and there, they didn't really much have anything to work with. It was a mystery in the 1950s, and the Soviets were trying their best to keep it clandestine. However, Kalashnikov was still not done. He was still refining and changing his design. And finally, in 1959, enter the AKM, the most produced assault rifle in the world. As mentioned before, the Soviet military-industrial complex, especially the Izhevsk arsenal, had issues with the ease of manufacturing of the AK-47, and especially with the stamped sheet metal receiver causing issues manufacturing the AK in large enough numbers. Finally, in 1959, Kalashnikov, with few revisions of the design, was accepted into service as the AKM. Now, it's important to note that most Soviet-made 7.62 by 39 millimeter caliber rifles, well, Kalashnikov rifles, are most likely AKMs and not AK-47s. And there are a few things to look out for if you want to differentiate an AK-47 from an AKM. Including, now there are also a lot of very minor technical changes in the manufacturing process, but I won't suffocate everyone with that today. Some changes include a revision to the pistol grip, new shape of the stock, a ribbed and stamped top cover, and most importantly, the stamped sheet metal receiver, where the Soviet military-industrial complex finally resolved its manufacturing issues and can now finally produce these stamped sheet metal Kalashnikov rifles in a large enough quantity to the content of the Soviet military. Others including no vent holes on the gas tube, which the original AK-47 had. And in 1965, the Shevsk arsenal started manufacturing AKMs with the slant triangular muzzle brake, which assisted in accuracy. And the AKM proved an instant hit with the Soviet military. It was quite liked by basically everybody. And finally, by the 1960s, this is where we have the collision of the Western world with the Kalashnikov assault rifle. In the mid-1960s, the United States entered Vietnam and fought for almost a decade, the conflict that we're all quite familiar. But the Soviet Union and other communist powers like China, North Korea, realized that they could assist their fellow communist allies in fighting the United States, and they gave a lot of Kalashnikov assault rifles to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. And when American soldiers were in Vietnam fighting the war, they went head-to-head finally with the Kalashnikov assault rifle. Now, it's also important to note that this is not technically the first time that the AK has seen combat. Historians believe that the 1956 Hungarian Revolution was the first time the AK saw service in battle. However, Vietnam was the start of the collision between the Kalashnikov and the United States. American soldiers going into Vietnam noticed that overwhelmingly these insurgents, these regular people, regular workers and farmers and other untrained individuals were using these weapons to deadly effect, and especially noting their great reliability. As we have the Viet Cong in the North Vietnamese army, armed exclusively almost with Kalashnikov rifles, the Americans were armed with the M16. Now, at the time, in the mid-1960s, the M16 was quite a forward-thinking design, unlike a lot of other combat rifles at the time, which exclusively used steel and wood, including the AK. The M16 emphasized the use of lightweight polymer material to reduce weight and was not susceptible to a lot of the typical issues that wood would have in an environment like Vietnam, where wood rots while plastic does not. However, the M16 was a much more mechanically complex rifle compared to the Kalashnikov, and this naturally caused problems in the very dirty, wet, humid areas of Vietnam, where a lot of infantrymen in the US complained that the M16 was not suited for this. However, then they looked over to their Vietnamese enemies, seeing the Kalashnikov not having such problems, and felt a variety of sentiments, a lot being envy. And a lot of, if I can use the term, mythology was born about the Kalashnikov. There are stories of Americans saying that they found Vietnamese insurgents taking rifles literally right out of a rice paddy and then chambering around, and it fires perfectly, that you can put it in the most dirty and uncomfortable situations for the rifle and it'll still function fine. And this is also the first time when the American public figures out what the AK is, as up to then, only members of US intelligence and the military really knew what the AK was, from intelligence reports and other things that they collected from Eastern Europe. The public had no idea what this was. However, finally in the Vietnam War, when, let's say, well, this is before the internet and other things like that, you're an average citizen and you pick up the paper or you turn on your TV to, let's say, CBS, and you see videos or live news reports, pictures from the war in Vietnam. And on the front page of that newspaper, whatever it may be, or on the evening broadcast on CBS, let's say, you would probably find some Vietnamese insurgents in their regular dirty civilians' clothes toting this thing. The Kalashnikov rifle. The rifle that supposedly is extremely reliable, easy to use. So easy to use that a uneducated worker or farmer can simply pick it up and start shooting at Americans with. And here is where we have that cementing of the AK as its role in the communist world, especially in competition against NATO. And as the 60s roll on into the 70s, the AK gains an even more important role within this clash of East versus West. Finally, out of the very secretive phase of its development in the 50s, it explodes in popularity with a variety of communist and anti-Western countries and movements across the world. So much so that by the 70s, the AK is viewed as the arm, the weapon itself of international communism, the communist world. Where, take for example, in the Western world, in NATO, in the United States, you have weapons like the M16, the Belgian FN FAL, and the West German G3 battle rifle, which gained massive popularity as their respective arms, and even weapons like the FN FAL gaining the moniker the right arm of the free world. The Kalashnikov had something quite similar, as it became the ultimate representation of communist military might. It proliferated across the world and back. Literally every single country in the Warsaw Pact used the Kalashnikov, the only exception being Czechoslovakia, which had their own design, the VZ-58. But even that took a little bit from the Kalashnikov rifle, including the caliber, 7.62 by 39 millimeter. But outside of the armed forces of the Warsaw Pact and other pro-communist countries, it had finally cemented itself internationally as the arm of communism itself, the weapon that will carry on international communism. As the 60s and 70s rolled on, and the AKM and even the AK-47 was exported to a variety of pro-Soviet or communist countries internationally, Kalashnikov was also busy, and once again improving on the design and introducing radical new changes to his weapon. And that's where we get to the early 1970s and the AK-74. By this point, a lot of major militaries were recognizing the great utility of a rifle that fired an intermediate but high velocity round. The Americans in 1964 adopted the M16, firing the small but high velocity 5.56 by 45 millimeter round. You had the Germans adopting the HK-33, also in 5.56, and in NATO, 5.56 was quickly becoming the caliber of choice for rifles, with a lot of older, large caliber battle rifles like the M14 or the G3 FAL still being popular, but technology started shifting in that direction of the small but high velocity caliber round. The Soviets were also interested in this concept. In the early 1970s, Kalashnikov began work on a version of the Kalashnikov that could fire a small but high velocity round. And in 1974, after a few years of work and experimentation, the AK-74 was introduced for service in the Red Army, firing the 5.45 by 39 millimeter small but high velocity round. And it instantly took off with the Soviet military, and a lot of other countries in the Warsaw Pact started to shift over slowly to the 5.45 by 39 millimeter round. But the AK-74 was not stagnant over time. There were changes and other modifications made. It is interesting to note that the original AK-74 prototypes were simply AKMs that were rechambered and rebarreled for the new round. And if you can actually take a look at the original prototypes, they look extremely similar to the AKM. However, by 1974, we finally have the separation of the AKM from the AK-74, with a few changes being the, as mentioned, the 5.45 by 39 millimeter round, which received its new orange so-called Bakelite magazine, and a new muzzle brake, which greatly improved accuracy compared to the older AKM and AK-47. And as the 70s and 80s went on, the Soviets, mostly in their manufacturing process, changed and tweaked things for ease of manufacture, and a lot of the traits that carried over from the AKM became completely separated by the end of the 70s. For example, even early production AK-74s from 1974 to 1977, you could still see a variety of holdovers from the AKM, most notably the 45-degree gas block from the AKM. However, by the late 1970s, the AK-74 finally shed its direct, I would say, lineage from the AKM, even though as a Kalashnikov rifle, they're all quite similar, but finally it quite distinguished itself. Its first combat debut was in the Soviet Union's intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. And it, like the Kalashnikov variants that came before it, was still very well received. It was a reliable weapon and was quite positively viewed on immediately by the Soviet armed forces. The Americans and NATO took quite interest into this new rifle. And like the original AK-47 designs of late 40s and 50s, during the first few years of the war, the Americans and NATO intelligence were getting bits and pieces of this new high-velocity, smaller caliber Kalashnikov variant. And supposedly, the CIA and their, how would I say, contacts within Pakistan were offering hundreds of thousands of dollars reward for anybody who can find a perfectly working AK-74 and ship it to the United States. And even though it's a bit more of a legend, there are some statements that claim that the reward was up to $500,000 for anyone who could find an AK-74 and ship it to the United States. However, as the Americans have done with the M16 in incorporating polymer furniture, finally in 1985, Yashevsk plant started manufacturing AK-74s with a purple plum colored polymer furniture, as they finally recognized and realized the advantage of using polymer materials over wood. And from 1985 to 1991, a variety of AK-74s in the Yashevsk and Tula production line were manufactured with this plum-colored furniture. However, by 1990, Kalashnikov and his team were working on even more improvements and changes to the AK-74, especially as material technology and manufacturing processes improved. And in 1990, we finally arrive to the AK-74M, the modernized version of the AK-74. In 1989 to 1990, the Yashevsk plant and the Soviet military wanted to fully incorporate polymer design into the Kalashnikov assault rifle and other streamlined manufacturing processes for this weapon. And finally, in 1990, they completed the AK-74M. It's all black polymer furniture compared to now this is quite important for differentiating between an AK-74M and a late 80s production polymer furniture AK-74, where the AK-74M has all black polymer furniture where the stock can fold to the side. It also has a smooth top cover, and all AK-74Ms have the standard Soviet Warsaw Pact dovetail optics mount on the left side of the receiver, while to give you a comparison, the polymer furnitured AK-74s do not have that. The Soviet military was quite enthusiastic for adopting this rifle, and by 1990, plans were fully underway to have this become the next standard issue service rifle for the Soviet Army. However, as many of you know, 1991 rolls around and the Soviet Union is no more. However, the AK-74M did not die with the USSR. The new Russian Federation, the Russian Army, instead took the AK-74M project and adopted it for itself. And in 1991, it became the standard issue service rifle for the Russian Army. However, just as with the collapse of the Soviet Union, many of us know the 1990s were not a good time for Russia, especially for their military. AK-74M production was quite slow, not to the extent that was initially hoped. A lot of Russian army forces still used original Soviet AK-74s. You could still find 74Ms in use with special forces and some army units, and its combat debut was in the wars in Chechnya in the mid-1990s all the way to 2000s, but only really in the 2000s did AK-74M production finally pick up. And to this day, the AK-74M is still, even though the AK-12 technically replaced it, the 74M is still the standard issue, or practically, standard issue service rifle for your average regular infantryman in the Russian army. But moving outside of Russia, the fall of the Soviet Union and the 1990s and entering the 21st century was a very important moment for the Kalashnikov assault rifle. As when the Soviet Union came apart and communism was dismantled at a rapid pace across all of Europe, a lot of these countries started selling off a lot of their giant Cold War era stocks of Kalashnikov assault rifles. Some countries in the former Warsaw Pact did it through legal means, but unfortunately, a lot of post-communist states being quite impoverished and full of corruption, especially former Soviet states, millions of Kalashnikov assault rifles were passed on to the black market internationally. And what once was seen as a rifle of communist or pro-Soviet governments and insurgents, where those were given by the Soviet Union, well, that being the Soviet government and military, and other allied communist governments, now this giant proliferation of Kalashnikov assault rifles was primarily done through illegal means, through smuggling and bribery and whatnot. And finally, in the 1990s, we see the mass proliferation of the Kalashnikov in battlefields and conflict zones that we are quite familiar going on today, such as in Afghanistan, Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Now, even before the Soviet Union collapsed, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan solidified in the memory of the West the image of a lot of these poor insurgents from a variety of conflict zones across the world wielding Kalashnikovs, as the Afghan Mujahideen, when fighting the Soviets, they would scavenge Soviet weapons and from the Soviet military, from the allied Afghan communist forces fighting alongside them, getting a lot of AKMs, AK-47s, and even Type 56s shipped in from Pakistan to use in their arsenal. And they themselves would trade it on and smuggle it to other allied groups across the world, including in the Middle East and Eurasia. However, in the 90s, after the collapse of communism and this mass proliferation, do we see a variety of these insurgent groups, terrorists, criminals, drug smuggling rings, and a variety of these other nefarious forces gain a massive surplus and market for these rifles. And in 2001, with the September 11 terrorist attacks and the beginning of the, as now called, global war on terror, we finally see a new major change in the perception of the Kalashnikov in the eyes of not just America, but the West, where American forces were now extremely involved overseas, either directly or indirectly, in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, fighting Islamic extremist insurgents. The Kalashnikov was almost exclusively there, making its presence ubiquitously known. And outside of the regular military forces for the United States, the American public would see a change in its perception of the Kalashnikov, where in the 60s and 70s and in the 80s, where we would see the Americans associate the AK with the forces of the Soviet Union, international communism, and communist insurgents, the shift now goes to the AK as a weapon of the criminal, of the Islamist terrorist, of the drug lord, and other nefarious groups. And across the 2000s, when now we have images and videos on the internet and TV, when the average American, just like in Vietnam, let's say when they see movies and news productions about the war in Vietnam and the AK-toting Viet Cong insurgent, now in the late 90s and 2000s, when let's say you turn on Fox News or CNN, MSNBC, the average American who knows practically nothing about firearms would constantly be bombarded with a variety of news clips and images of individuals like this, the masked Muslim insurgent calmly walking about with his stolen Kalashnikov assault rifle. And even to this day, it remains in this perception for most people. Now, however, I must note that the AK assault rifle is not just only an assault rifle. The Kalashnikov and his team worked on a variety of different roles for the weapon system, other than just being a regular infantryman's rifle, often at the request of the Soviet military. In 1959, you had the introduction of the AKM. However, Kalashnikov in the early 60s took his core design of the rifle and used it to manufacture a machine gun, the PK, and eventually the RPK. The PK is a belt-fed weapon, a general-purpose machine gun, and it entered service in 1960. And in Russian, PK stands for Pulemyot Kalashnikova, or Kalashnikov's machine gun. And compared to the rifle, it's just an elongated and scaled-up action of the rifle. And if you actually were to take the rifle and flip it upside down, you basically have the action of the PK machine gun. However, with the PK, it was not the only iteration for the machine gun, as in 1969, the PKM, a modernized version, was introduced with an unfluted lighter barrel and easier manufacturing. However, also in the 1960s and 1961, you had the introduction of a squad automatic weapon, not a large, unwieldy belt-fed machine gun, but as a squad automatic weapon, they were merely assault rifles that were extended in size, given larger magazines, a bipod, and that's how the Soviets introduced the RPK, or in Russian stands for Ruchnoy Pulemyot Kalashnikova, meaning Kalashnikov's handheld machine gun. And just like the AK, the RPK is undoubtedly the most popular squad automatic weapon in the world. The PK also shares the title of one of the most popular general-purpose machine guns in the world. And this trend also continued into the 74, where in 1974, the AK-74 introduced, but at the same time, the RPK version, the RPK-74, where it was just as like the regular AKM-based RPK. It was just a AK-74 with an extended barrel, a different stock, larger magazine, a bipod to fill the squad automatic weapon role. However, in 1979, the Soviets introduced a carbine length version. Well, to clarify, a carbine is just a rifle with a much shorter barrel, the AKS-74U. The Soviets had taken note of American experiences in Vietnam and their carbine length weapons like the XM-177 Commando, the CAR-15, and the Soviet military grew interested in the notion of a carbine length AK. And in the late 1970s, Kalashnikov, under which I believe it was called Project Modern, got to work under to create a carbine length AK. And in 1977, he finalized and entered service with had his rifle enter service as the AKS-74U, but only in 1979 was it properly accepted for service within the Soviet military. And this also continues with the AK-74M of the Russian Federation in 1991, where it was also made into a squad automatic weapon, the RPK-74M, and also a carbine length rifle, the AK-105, introduced in 1994. However, also important note for nomenclature with Russian firearms, the S in AKS stands for skladnoy, in Russian meaning folding or a folding stock. As also with the AK-47, AKM, and AK-74, there were folding stock variants which received the designation AKS. For example, the folding stock variant of the AKM is called AKMS, which translated means Kalashnikov's assault rifle modernized folding stock. Same thing for the 74. However, for the 74U, which is a carbine, the U stands for ukorachony, meaning shortened, or for the shortened barrel. So meaning Kalashnikov's assault rifle folding stock, model 1974, shortened barrel. Which it's pretty utilitarian for the aspects of the weapon. And outside the rifle, a whole family of different weapons for different purposes were put to use by the Soviet military. However, into the 2000s, after the chaos of the 1990s, you have the creation of the so-called 100 series AKs in 1994. As Kalashnikov's concern, well, it would now be known as Kalashnikov, sir, but the Yashevsk plant, under Kalashnikov's direction, they wanted to take the technology of the AK-74M and adopt it to create a family of weapons that were cost-effective to manufacture, but could have a lot of interchangeable parts for streamlined manufacturing. And that's where you have the, even though a lot of these rifles have different barrel lengths and calibers, a lot of the parts were quite interchangeable. The family includes variants in 5.56 NATO, in the original 7.62 by 39mm M43, the 5.45 M74 round, and in the subsonic 9x39 caliber. The full-length rifles include the AK-101, which is in 5.56, the AK-103, which is in the original 7.62 round, and the original 1991 AK-74M, which is in 5.45. For carbines, you have the carbine length version of the AK-101, similar to the carbine length version of the AK-103, called the AK-104, and a carbine length version of the AK-74M, called the AK-105. And you also had the creation more of as none of them were really saw any kind of service. They were still quite stuck in the prototype phases, even to this day. Rifles with a balanced recoil mechanism, where, well, I shall demonstrate this with image later on, where instead of just the simple gas tube system that would sit on top of the rifle, you would also have a mechanism where a reciprocating rod would go forward every single time the rifle would fire to balance recoil. And it was quite a complicated system. I'm not a mechanical engineer. But it was a much more mechanically complex system that was viewed as an excellent way to eliminate recoil. And in this balanced recoil mechanism, the AKs include the AK-108, which is in 5.56 NATO, the AK-109, which is in 7.62 by 39mm, and the AK-107, which is in 5.45. And there is also a suppressed subsonic chambered Kalashnikov carbine variant called AK-9, which is in 9x39, a subsonic round that's primarily designed for use with suppressed weapons. It's not the first time it's been used. In the late 80s, the Soviets introduced the AS-Val and the VSS Vintor as internally suppressed weapons, but the caliber would eventually be adapted for the AK with the AK-9. And to give you a demonstration of this design philosophy with the 100 series, this is what they look like. As you can see, other than caliber and maybe barrel, muzzle devices and attachments, they are quite similar in a lot of their parts and components. And this was the point, to have a family of rifles that were easy to manufacture, could fill different roles for different calibers depending on what the customer wanted, and at the same time have the Kalashnikov core components of being a reliable infantryman's rifle. And here's the 101, the 102, the 103 in different calibers. This one being 5.56, carbine variant, this in 7.62, and its carbine variant. This being the carbine variant of the AK-74M in 5.45, the AK-9, which is a suppressed weapon, and the balanced recoil, the Kalashnikov variants, as you can see with the elongated gas tube going up to the front sight, which is where the reciprocating rod mechanism for recoil canceling, or canceling, as some people refer to, is housed. And by the 2000s, you have the evolution of the Kalashnikov, not just as an assault rifle or a carbine, but for a whole host of different purposes. You had Kalashnikov being adapted for designated marksman rifles and sniper rifles. You had AKs being manufactured as shotguns. You had AKs manufactured for the civilian hunting market. You had Kalashnikovs with completely new, interesting mechanisms for magazines, like the PP Bizon with its bizarre 64-round helical magazine. And a lot of countries, not just in Russia, manufactured their own takes on the AK. For example, just to show here is the Serbian-Yugoslavian Zastava M91, a sniper rifle, which is just an AK action, but extended. You have the Russian PP Bizon submachine gun, chambered in 9mm Makarov with its strange helical magazine. You have its successor, the Vityaz submachine gun, the PP 09 Vityaz is its full name, which is much more conventional as it has a 30-round magazine, but chambered in 9mm. The Saiga 12, the Kalashnikov adapted into a shotgun, a semi-automatic shotgun, and the Vepr series hunting rifles adapted for the civilian market, both in Russia and internationally. And by the 2000s, Kalashnikov had become not just a rifle, but it's almost like an institution, a brand, an idea. It had a use for everything, whether it be a firearm, or it was even adapted for things not even related with firearms. Kalashnikov started manufacturing watches and pocket knives. There was brands of Kalashnikov vodka that are still sold today. That's kind of, come to think about it, the most Russian thing I've ever heard. Kalashnikov vodka. But it had become absolutely ubiquitous. It had now reached its worldwide reach and maximum potential. However, Russia was not done with the Kalashnikov, as in the early 2010s, there were experiments and a lot of interest with adopting modern materials and other design ideas into updating the AK for modern warfare, especially when you have the United States and NATO adopting weapons with full polymer furniture with Picatinny rails for accessories for mounting red dots, with stocks that are customizable and collapsible in 4 different positions, and a lot of focus on modularity and having your infantry rifle adapt a lot of different accessories, whether it be lasers, red dots, flashlights, anything like that. Kalashnikov also recognized that, and in the early 2010s, they got to work on a Kalashnikov rifle for the 21st century, a modern AK, the so-called AK-12 for 2012. Even though working prototypes were done in 2012, 2013, interestingly enough, the Russian military was not satisfied with it whatsoever. And between 2012 and 2016, Kalashnikov concern went through a variety of different prototypes, changes to narrow down the rifle to the specifications that the Russian military wanted, as there were a variety of issues, strangely enough, with ease of manufacture and reliability. But finally, in 2016, a revised version of the AK-12 was accepted into service with the Russian military. And in 2017, 2018, units of the VDV, Russia's paratrooper force, started receiving their new AK-12s along with the army afterwards. And like the Kalashnikovs of before, it has been modified into its own little family of variants, where you have, this is to clarify, the revised 2016 AK-12 that was accepted for service. But also you have a version of the AK-12 in 7.62 by 39 millimeter for the export market, the AK-15. Same thing with the AK-19, which is chambered in 5.56 NATO. You have the AK-12K, which is a carbine length weapon, and the RPK-16, a squad automatic version of the AK-12, which is interesting to note that it does not have a much longer barrel and a bipod. It can accept accessories like bipods, but it comes standard with a large drum magazine. And these weapons are supposedly, even though they have not completely replaced the old 74 and 74M, the new standard issue service rifle of the Russian military. And there are still revisions to the design taking place to this day, especially in the backdrop of the war in Ukraine. And that is where we are in the modern day. But putting aside all of everything that happened with the rifle, within the military and everything, the AK has transcended even that and become something more in our culture and society as a general. Especially since the 1960s and the war in Vietnam, the Kalashnikov has entered into the common consciousness of the average person who has never picked up a rifle, never served in any combat roles in the military, nothing. Whether it be movies, video games, TV shows, comic books, you name it, it's there. Even in music, the Kalashnikov has showed up. It is almost everywhere. And especially since the start of the global war on terror, you have a new identity born for the Kalashnikov, where it is almost a rifle for everybody anywhere in the world, whether it's for, and this also comes with its common portrayal in culture, it has been seen with criminals, drug lords, mercenaries, insurgents, revolutionaries, regular soldiers and armies. It is everywhere. And a lot of, even if you don't know anything about anything with guns or military, you've seen this thing probably somewhere, whether it be probably maybe like a movie, like for example, take in 1984 film Red Dawn, where you have American guerrilla fighters proudly toting their captured AK rifles from Soviet forces and using it in true partisan fashion. Or whether it be, let's say, in video games like Call of Duty, where you have a variety of enemies, whether it be Russians or Middle Eastern insurgents, with their very, how would I say, I guess, creative interpretations of the Kalashnikov. Or most bizarrely, the Kalashnikov has showed up in science fiction and other bizarre fields of media that you would not expect it. It's showed up as converted into energy weapons that can fire lasers or plasma, and it's been converted to be used in movies where it's an airburst grenade launcher, like in Elysium, or it's even showed up in Star Wars with the film, or I believe it is a television program, Andor, where some of the protagonists have Kalashnikovs that have been visibly mocked up to make them into energy weapons. It is everywhere. You cannot find a place where the AK is not somewhere. However, as mentioned, since it has become so popular, there's a mythology that has been built up around Kalashnikov. Like all things that are popular in this world, there are myths and stories and legends that are told and passed about of whether it be, in this case, it's the Kalashnikov. So I've accumulated a few common myths and other things that are passed about of the Kalashnikov that are either completely untrue, mostly untrue, or they miss out on a lot of things. The first one is arguably the most popular in the world. The AK is invincible. It's never jamming. You can do whatever you want with it. It's going to run no matter what happens with it. Well, now, the AK is a very reliable weapon. Kalashnikov spent a lot of time making sure that it is a reliable weapon, that the average infantryman conscript in the Red Army does not have to worry that much about the weapon. But like all machines, a machine can fail. If, let's say, I take a Kalashnikov and I dump mud directly into the ejection port, I highly doubt that thing is going to fire. And so simply saying, oh, you could dump sand and mud into the ejection port, you pick it up, like those Vietnamese insurgents in the rice paddies, and it's just going to fire flawlessly. That's not really going to happen. Like all weapons, including in the Soviet military, you were instructed to clean and maintain your weapon. It was reliable and it was tolerant of a variety of loose particulate matter that could get in, but you would still have to pay some attention that your weapon does not have, let's say, so much garbage in it that it clogs it up. And going to number 2 here is also a very common myth I've seen passed about, is that the AK is a direct copy of the German Sturmgewehr 44. It's Kalashnikov stole it, he took everything from it, it's a shameless copy, very little is different. That is not really true. It is true that Kalashnikov did take some level of inspiration from the Sturmgewehr, especially as a concept of a weapon system, an intermediate caliber firing select fire magazine-fed weapon. The only thing that's really directly, I guess you could say, the same about the AK and the STG is maybe the gas piston system. But other than that, it's quite different. I could make the case that there's just as much in common with the Sturmgewehr and the AK as just with the G3 or the M16. All of these rifles did take inspiration from weapons like the Sturmgewehr. And a little bit tying into number 1, number 3 is often quite tied in, where the AK is a super inaccurate weapon that you were just designed to show up, spray lead on full auto, and that's basically it. Not really. The Soviet military were specific that the Kalashnikov was supposed to be an accurate weapon, not a precision weapon, but accurate to a degree for an infantry rifle as it is. I believe that this myth probably comes from a lot of the media that we see of a lot of poorly, terribly untrained, let's say like Vietnam-era guerrillas, the Viet Cong, or Islamist terrorists, who often have absolutely no military training other than the fact that their commanding officers just, here, take this rifle and go shoot at the Americans, level of well, that's basically what they did. And of course, being totally untrained, they're going to show up and spray Lenin full auto. And hence, that's why we probably think that way. Even all the way to today, the Soviet and later Russian militaries, of course, stressed that as a soldier, you're supposed to be accurate with your weapon. And if the AK was so inaccurate, it would have never been accepted into service in 1947. They would have picked something else. Number 4 is kind of similar vein to number 2, where the SVD sniper rifle is claimed to be a direct copy of the AK. That's not true at all. Yes, they do have some outwardly similar arrangement as a rifle, but the SVD and its designer, Yevgeny Dragunov, were quite insistent that this was designed completely separately as a precision weapon for Soviet snipers rather than the Kalashnikov. There are, however, I must mention that there are rifles based off the Kalashnikov that are made as designated marksman rifles or sniper rifles like the Yugoslavian M76 or the M91 and the Romanian PSL, which are AK assault rifle actions but stretched out and scaled out to be filled in as a sniper rifle. The SVD is not that. It is a separate weapon. And number 5, the AK is a crude weapon that was poorly made. That's not really true. Well, for the Soviet Union, the AKs were, as a product, made to a satisfactory quality level. Really, when you start seeing poor quality made AKs, are those primarily made outside of the Warsaw Pact, like in China or Ethiopia or Pakistan is when you start seeing AKs of very dubious quality. But Kalashnikovs made in the Soviet Union were not crude, overly poorly made weapons at all. They were manufactured to a very specific industrial grade standard. If it was a poorly made weapon, they, as mentioned, they would have not accepted it. They were not in a wartime scenario. There was no need to reduce the quality to such a terrible level like during the Second World War. They actually made it to a quality standard. And number 6 is kind of a bit more also tied in with number 3 and number 1, where every AK you see today is probably an AK-47. Unfortunately, this is a mistake commonly made by individuals who don't know much or at all about it. This is not a insult or anything like that. It's just simple lack of knowledge, that's all. But a lot of times you see, no matter what rifle it is, they'll say that's an AK-47. 9 out of 10 times, it is not an AK-47. It is maybe an AKM, maybe an Norinco Type 56, maybe an AK-74, the 74M, maybe it's a Romanian PM-MD63, maybe it's a Yugoslavian M70. But it is most likely not an AK-47. Common mistake, unfortunately made by a lot of very important people in high places, but that is a whole can of worms for something else. And finally, this is more of a niche thing, but I see this claimed a lot with people who supposedly are familiar with it, where they claim that the AN-94 and the AEK-971 are AK variants. That's not true. They were designed separately from the Kalashnikov. Sure, outwardly, they might look like, I guess, if I can say that, like an AK, but they're separate weapons, separate designers. They were aimed to fill a separate purpose. I don't expect the average individual to know that, but that's a myth that exists. But as we have seen in the present, there is also the future. So what is the future for Kalashnikov? Now, as many of us know, the Soviet Union and communism are no more, well, at least in 95% of the world. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 along with the Warsaw Pact. Kalashnikov himself died in 2013. And as time goes on, this country, the Soviet Union, and Kalashnikov himself will become a more distant memory. But the rifle lives on. And even as all of them are gone, it is very likely that the AK will still keep going in some way. Its core appeal as a very cost-effective weapon to manufacture, very easy to use, easy to maintain, extremely common, no matter who manufactures it, will make it attractive to whoever it is. It could be armies, insurgent groups, terrorists, criminals, mercenaries, it doesn't matter. It will most likely remain for many years to come as an affordable but still an effective choice for an infantryman's rifle. And even though technology progresses and things change, the Kalashnikov, even if it's not in its still original form, will probably be improved and adjusted and tweaked and all that in the years to come. The Russians are already doing that with the AK-12, and it's still aimed that the AK will still persist to the far future, both here in the United States and wherever in the world. And that is all that I have. Thank you for your time. I appreciate whoever is viewing and watching, and I give my thanks. However, I would like to open the floor to questions. Are there any questions that anybody has? I know that we have viewers that are online, so if there is a text chat or whatnot functioning, you may submit yours there.
So I'll put it out there. But you answered the one question that I had. I was going to say something about the AN-94 and the AEK 971. So even though they weren't designed as Kalashnikovs, but they shared ergonomic functions, I guess is a way to put it.
Yes.
They shared like a shape, and so I guess if they could be considered in the wider family, much like say the for the Americans, like or I would say for like NATO countries, the 416 is not really a Colt AR type weapon, but it shares that platform, or shares the ergonomic functions of that platform. It looks very similar, even though it's not, I guess, a direct lineal descendant. But yeah, so you kind of really covered that. That's very interesting.
But
Comments.
well, I mean, I would argue that the 416 and the original M16 M4 have more in common rather than the AN-94 and AEK 971 and the original Kalashnikov rifle. I would just more argue that outwardly, shape of the weapon is the most common. If you look internally, and even with ergonomics, it's different from the Kalashnikov. Even the Russian armed forces had their own issues with the departure from the original Kalashnikov design with the AN-94 and AEK 971. The AN-94, even though it was officially accepted into service by the Army, very few were manufactured, as the AN-94 had a whole host of terrible reliability problems, especially with its very complicated internal mechanism, a absolute blasphemy to the design mantra of Kalashnikov himself, which stressed a simple but effective and reliable weapon. The AK-971 was not plagued with that many issues, but the Russian armed forces did not really see that big of an interest in replacing the AK with those weapons. They have their own very small niche within the Russian military, primarily with special forces, law enforcement, and very select units within either intelligence, law enforcement, military agencies. I would argue that the AN-94 and AEK 971 are 10 times as more popular in video games rather than in reality, as they're quite odd-looking weapons. So it's quite an appealing choice for, let's say, a game designer to have something like that. And hence that's why people get this false impression that, oh, it's just a weird-looking AK, which is not really the case.
Yes, I'll say that. That's how I know it. I don't know. I don't expect to see any of them ever in real life. But thank you for that. And then Carol's asking, how would you like to use your vast knowledge that you showed off today, and where do you see yourself in the future? And I guess that could be more general. And then I guess you could say something about like how would you use this type of information that you presented going forward. So a lot of different ways to answer that.
Well, for me, as a poli-sci grad from American University, I always view myself as being in government institutions and advising role, especially and putting aside all the firearms related things with the AK, the proliferation and trade of the AK as a weapon system is very important in international relations, arms control, things like that. So the people who do a lot of things like that, they may themselves have not even touched a gun in their life before or done anything with their armed forces. There are some things that they would need to know about that. And I see myself in the future in a role that would cover something like that, especially, let's say, if you're working in the United Nations or the State Department, and you have to tackle issues of things like illegal arms proliferation, which the AK is, it's almost synonymous with it, where you would have to know things like, where was this manufactured? Who made this? Why is it here? Who sold it to them? Stuff like that. And you would have to tackle the history, even technical information about stuff with the Kalashnikov.
Excellent. So you've got the Soviet Union, right?
Yes.
They were, or the Soviet bloc, and it seems
Warsaw
like
Pact.
everyone was making it.
Yes.
Who's making it today? Who's producing it?
Everyone.
You're saying Yugoslavia, Romania, whomever.
So the list of manufacturers and countries that make Kalashnikov is absolutely mind-boggling, to be honest.
They still produce it. I mean, these countries are still producing it.
So Poland, Russia, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania.
So we have 3 NATO states and countries now on the listing. So we have the Soviets, of course, doing their thing. Is there any control? Do the Russians know that these states or countries are still producing it? Or
Oh, they do. Keep in mind that all of these countries that are now in NATO, they have all the production equipment and licensing from the Soviet time, so they just keep manufacturing more of them. Well, not the same as back then, but variants in their own iterations. East Germany made their own Kalashnikovs, but when they were reunified with West Germany in 1989, they stopped production. But out of all the countries in the former Warsaw Pact communist bloc, I know, going off the top of my head, it's, as mentioned, Russia, more just now in Europe, Finland, Russia, Poland, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, all make their own Kalashnikov rifles. And going across internationally, the list goes on and on and on. The United States also has its own private industry of manufacturers here that make all American-made AKs, especially since 2014, when the Obama administration made importation of Russian arms completely illegal. A whole industry now exists in America of American firearms manufacturers making American-made AKs, sometimes with parts imported, and other times parts that are made almost entirely here in the United States. It's quite extensive.
as long as we have control over it.
Well, that's true. Of course, a lot of these countries and manufacturers are subject to a law and regulation, but keep in mind that a lot of the Kalashnikov seen internationally are still Soviet communist era made weapons that are just traded illegally on the black market. And the AK is not immune to this. And if any arms whatsoever can get into the hands of illegal actors, they'll resell it. I mean, we've seen this with the M4 and the M16A4. When the United States exited Afghanistan a few years ago, a lot of arms were left over, a lot of M4A1s, M16A4s. And when the Taliban rolled in, they took everything, and a lot of them are now being resold on illegal arms markets. Now, in Central Asia, for example, before the exit, if you wanted an illegally smuggled US-made M4A1, it would cost you around ballpark maybe $4,000, $4,500. Now, since there's a much larger supply, floating around in the arms market from the withdrawal, you could get a fully working M4A1, maybe with a Neotech or an ACOG, for around 1,500.
Of all the U.S. Institutions, which of our government institutions would be responsible to oversee what's out there? What is
So for
like the CIA or the State Department?
So for just domestically manufacturing firearms, because that is all subject to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. But for exports, that's all under, I believe, U.S. Customs and Border Protection.
I mean, internationally, whatever's going on internationally, this monthly, whatever, is it ATF or is it the CIA or the State Department or other?
Well, if it's international arms trading, then that more falls under either the host nation that it takes place in, or under more broad international institutions, let's say under the United Nations. But it is a very, very tricky issue to manage, especially for these supranational organizations, because this is all clandestine. It's not written on, say, a bank statement or whatnot.
Does the museum here have any interesting pieces? Of these older ones, the ones that he was mentioning from.
So if you're talking just specifically about the AKs,
So we have a few different Kalashnikov rifles here. For example, the one that we have display up here is a Romanian PMMD-63 with the folding stock. It has been modified afterwards with a polymer lower foregrip. As mentioned, it's made in Romania. This is the version that's for export internationally, including ones made or sold here in the United States. The museum also has a Hungarian-produced Kalashnikov for the U.S. civilian market. We also have a Chinese Type 56 S1 rifle that's in one of our public display cases here. And I believe that is all that the museum has in inventory. Are there any other questions?
Very interesting. Very good. So,
If that is all, thank you all who have been listening and paying attention.
I have a question. I noticed that they began making various models in the 5.56 NATO.
Yes.
Is that for what purpose would they use that? For own armed forces or?
No, it's all for export, because there are a lot of countries internationally that have the 5.56 NATO round but are interested in a weapon system like the Kalashnikov. So the AK-101 and 102 are basically tailored for that. The 100 series is a very export-oriented family of weapons. It's a lot of countries internationally use the 100 series a lot more, even actually in our neck of the woods. For example, Venezuela manufactures the AK-103 domestically, and it's the standard issue service rifle of their military.
In the 5.56?
No, in 7.62 by 39 millimeter.
Oh.
The 103. But yeah. Is the camera still rolling?
Well, if nobody else has any questions, I guess since Andrew stepped out for a moment, I guess we should thank you for giving us this talk. Very informative.
Anytime.
Today that I learned today just exactly how much I didn't know about AKs, and I appreciate it as one individual at least. So thank you very much.
Anytime. Were there any questions left in maybe, I think, comments or?
No, just Carol told me to take photos, though. So I'll just take one more photo as we're talking. All right, 3, 2, 1. Very good, excellent. All right, that is a
What
wrap.
about can you put the initial screen up where you had the Soviet soldiers and your name on the screen?
Oh, those were Russian. It's not Soviet. It's modern day. Those were.
Well, yeah.
That's a wrap.
force of habit. I'm sorry.
Understandable.